The Shrinking Middle Class, a current events documentary by Catherine Lord. Over the course of the year, I have been researching the shrinking middle class. So, in order to gain a better understanding of my topic, I first had to determine who was part of the middle class. This led me to my first piece of research, a study done by the Pew Research Center. According to this study, 49% of Americans consider themselves to be part of the middle class. This number is much lower than it was in 2008. In 2008, 53% of Americans considered themselves part of the middle class. I also learned from this article that middle class is determined by average income annually. On average, for the American middle class, the income is $70,000 a year. Here are some other statistics that I learned from my first article. This data came from my first piece of research, the Pew Research Center study. This research shows who is part of the middle class. This is important to understanding my topic because it's important to know who's in the middle class so that I can determine how it has changed over the years and what has caused it to change. This chart is proof that the middle class has been shrinking. After I determined who was part of the middle class, I began to research more on what caused the shrinking middle class. Here's what I found from my first piece of research. This information came from the Pew Research Center. As you can see, most of the middle class blames Congress for the hardships faced by the middle class in the past 10 years. This led me to wonder why the middle class blames Congress and what Congress can do about the shrinking middle class. My first piece of research from the Pew Research Center was very helpful in helping me understand how the middle class has shrunk over the years and who is considered part of the middle class. In order to support this data, I had to do more research. So my first piece of extra research came from an article called By the Numbers, the Incredibly Shrinking American Middle Class. Here's what I found from this article. My previous research led me to believe that the middle class is shrinking. This graph supports that research because it shows that the median household income has drastically decreased from 2005 to 2012. In 2005, families made an average of $56,000 a year, whereas in 2012, they only make $51,000. This shows that the middle class is shrinking and families are making less each year. In addition to these statistics, I also used an article from the Washington Post to support the claim that the middle class is shrinking. A main idea expressed in this article is that one of the main causes of the shrinking middle class is because of inequality in paychecks. An example of this inequality is the fact that more than 50% of income, American annual income, goes to the upper class, which causes upper class people to get richer and lower class people to get poorer. Here is a chart that supports that. This piece of information came from the Washington Post. As you can see from this chart, most of the distribution of household income is going to the upper class people. This is creating a weak middle class. This supports the idea that the middle class is shrinking because the upper class is becoming stronger. This article from the Washington Post provided an alternative point of view because it suggested that the reason the middle class is shrinking is because more people are moving up to the upper class because there is an unequal distribution of money. This article also provided bias against the government, which made me wonder what the government is doing to prevent the shrinking middle class and how politics is affecting this topic. So, this led me to the second stage of my research. For the second stage of my research, I wanted to determine how the government is influencing the shrinking middle class. I found that one main cause for the shrinking middle class is the minimum wage. There is much controversy over the minimum wage. Some politicians believe that raising the minimum wage would jumpstart the economy and provide more income for families. However, other politicians believe that raising the minimum wage would cause inflation and would cause rising unemployment rates. So, here's my research that I found regarding the minimum wage. My first piece of research was an article entitled, "The $7.25 Minimum Wage is Too Low for 21st Century America." This article supported the idea that the shrinking middle class is caused by the minimum wage, and the author of the article believes that the middle wage should be raised. Bias is shown in this article because the author is biased against the government and feels that the government should take more actions in raising the minimum wage. After reading this article, I decided to do more research on the minimum wage at the state and federal level. So, I went to the website for the U.S. Department of Labor. This website showed the minimum wage for the United States and for each state individually. Interestingly enough, I found that under Governor O'Malley, Maryland is currently raising the minimum wage. It used to be $7.25. I also found that 21 states have a minimum wage over the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25. 20 states have a minimum wage equal to the federal wage. 4 states have a minimum wage under the federal minimum wage, and 5 states have no minimum wage. Like I said, there is much controversy over what should be done about the minimum wage. These two political cartoons, another part of my research, support the idea that the minimum wage should not be raised because job growth would decline and many workers would be laid off. These political cartoons show that by raising the minimum wage, it'll be harder to find a job for workers and many workers will be laid off, causing a shrinking middle class. In addition to these political cartoons, I also found ads from the MinimumWage.com website that support the idea that raising the minimum wage would be bad for the economy. This is an ad that says that raising the minimum wage would cause job loss. However, the following example is proof that some politicians believe that raising the minimum wage would be good for the economy. This ad was also found on MinimumWage.com. To conclude, the minimum wage is a major cause of the shrinking middle class. On one hand, if the minimum wage is raised, then the middle class will shrink because many workers will be laid off. On the other hand, if the minimum wage is not raised, then the middle class will still shrink because families aren't making enough money to support themselves. At the beginning of my research, I believed that raising the minimum wage would solve the problem of the shrinking middle class. However, having completed this research, I determined that raising the minimum wage would not solve the problem. In fact, it would make it worse. If we were to raise the minimum wage, millions of workers would lose their jobs. This is because big companies could not afford to pay so many workers. Because of the controversy regarding the minimum wage, I wanted to research more about how the political parties are affecting the middle class. For this stage in my research, I wanted to determine how Obama's budget plan would influence the middle class. This is some research I found from the CNN website. This chart shows that under Obama's proposed 2015 budget plan, all income groups would experience tax raises. This means that the middle class would shrink because taxes would be higher, so families would have less spending money, and they would drop from the middle class to the lower class. After doing this research, I wanted to find out more about how Obama's budget plan compared to Mitt Romney's budget plan. Here's what I found. This information was found from a blog on the Washington Post website. This chart shows the differences in tax plans for Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. As you can see, Barack Obama's budget plan included raising taxes for the top % of people. Mitt Romney's budget plan included cutting taxes for the top 60% of people, which includes most of the middle class. The chart on the Washington Post website shows an alternative point of view than the article found on the CNN website because it implies that the middle class would not experience tax raises under President Obama's budget plan. It also implies that the middle class is not shrinking because of this budget plan. After doing research on Obama's budget plan, I wanted to do more research on specific parts of the budget plan, such as healthcare. Here is a political cartoon that expresses an opinion that Obamacare has raised taxes for many people. This political cartoon implies two main ideas. The first idea is that not many politicians know everything about Obamacare. The second idea implied is that Obamacare would raise taxes. My final piece of research on the topic of taxes came from an article on the NBC website. This article went into more detail about Obama's tax plan for the 2014 year. The tax plan included tax cuts for many groups of people, including certain interest groups, college students, and families. However, it did raise taxes for upper-earning citizens. From this information, I can conclude that Obama's presidency has not influenced the shrinking middle class. Therefore, that taxes do not play a big part in the shrinking middle class. All of my previous research led me to my final article, an article on the Wall Street Journal website about who was considered part of the middle class and about how the middle class cannot be defined by annual income. This is a chart that shows all of the middle class. As you can see from the chart, the income for the middle class is greatly varied. This shows that the middle class cannot simply be defined by annual income. There are many other factors that come to play. The middle class is influenced by many other factors, not just annual income. For example, it is influenced by retirement costs, education costs, healthcare funds, and many other funds that are needed to support a middle-class family. From this information, I learned that the main cause of the shrinking middle class cannot be defined by one thing, nor can it be fixed by just one solution. So to summarize my research, the minimum wage is one cause for the shrinking middle class. However, there's no good solution for that, because if we were to raise the minimum wage, many workers would get laid off because companies could not afford to pay as many workers. Whereas if we keep the minimum wage where it is, workers aren't making enough to support their family. My second piece of research was on taxes. However, with taxes, it really evens itself out. It's not a main cause of the shrinking middle class because tax rates are based on the annual income of a person, the size of their family, and various other factors. And all of these factors are what leads to a strong middle class, and ultimately which leads to a shrinking middle class. And my final piece of research was on how the middle class is defined. And honestly, there's no way to define the middle class because you could define it just by annual income. But there are so many other factors that come to play. There's such a loose definition of the middle class. So really to say that the middle class is shrinking, there are many factors that need to be examined. And I examined these factors this year. And what I learned was that the middle class is shrinking. People's annual incomes is not dropping, but prices are going up because of inflation. Workers are getting laid off. The minimum wage is low, not high enough to support families. Tax rates are increasing. And all of this is leading to a shrinking middle class. So, the question now is, what do we do about it? Well, we could lobby government officials to raise the minimum wage, but that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem. We could elect politicians who are running for office who promise lower taxes, but that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem either. In the end, there's really no solution to the shrinking middle class. Politicians are going to promise many things, including helping the middle class. However, it really depends on the people and what they're willing to do and how hard they're willing to work to really fix the problem of the shrinking middle class.